She can feel it coming. It was in the air. It tasted harsh and sterile in her mouth. It singed her nostrils and stung her eyes. It prickled her skin like thorns and pressed down on her chest like stones. An eyelid overflowed, allowing a single teardrop to escape and trickle down the side of her cheek. The tracheal breathing tube snaked down her throat, rubbing it raw as it pushed air into her chest. A symphony of melancholy played in the background, from arrhythmic beeps of machines pumping medicine into her dying body to make the pain bearable. That is how Rebecca welcomed the arrival of 1988. She laid in the hospital room, conscious of her surroundings, unaware of the microbes gorging themselves, taking advantage of an immune system no longer capable of keeping them at bay. She laid in her hospital bed in the blackness, slowly drowning in the phlegm, dripping and collecting in the empty spaces within her lungs. She was alone and in agony when she waited for death's inevitable approach. The only light was from buttons on the pumps that reflected off the IV stands. The morphine confused her sometimes. Now, she was not alone. Monotonous, regular intervals of called out from compressed air of a ventilator. The respirator covered most of her face, but over its thick rubber rim that created the airtight seal, she could make out the shapes of 7 towering winged figures. They stood side by side, hands interlocked with one another. They gave off a soft glow that held back the darkness. Just beyond the reach of the light, and hidden in the shadows, hordes of dark and slimy things waited impatiently. The 7 whispered into her head with desperation. They begged her and pleaded with her over and over again. Say it, say it, say it now. Say it, you're running out of time. Say it before it's too late. You must say it. Say it, it's the only way. We cannot help you if you don't say it. Well, I've been waiting for this moment for all my life. Oh Lord, I can feel it coming in the air tonight. Oh Lord, well I've been waiting for this moment for all my life. Oh Lord, oh Lord. Her mind drifted back to a time when she was young and innocent. Even now, she dreams of herself still like that cute little girl from so long ago. She mourns for that child. She never stood a chance. They all told her how pretty she was. Friends, family, and neighbors. Her father told her she was the most beautiful little girl in the whole world. Her daddy would tell her this many times, late at night, with the smell of cheap liquor on his breath. Her last memory of him was his hands around her throat, trying to squeeze the life out of her. After the divorce, when she was 12, her stepdad also exclaimed how beautiful she was. He embedded those words into her memory under the weight of his sweaty body. Her first boyfriend said he'd never seen a girl as pretty as her and showered her with kisses of affection and backhands out of rage. He said it would be a terrible shame to have to mess up such a lovely face if she told anyone what he did to her. By the time she had turned 16, no hint of that sweet little girl had remained. Like the fate that would come to her older self, she too died in pain and loneliness. The adult she became lived a life of bitterness and hate. She took pleasure from inflicting that which was done to her. Her body was used as a vessel for pleasure and a means to obtain any chemical or substance within her reach. She was ready for the end when the doctor told her she was sick, and they didn't know why. The voices of the seven were growing distant, as if they had accepted her as a lost cause. She thought of the wicked and vindictive things she had ever done. With the last bit of her strength, she asked for forgiveness. She said, "Yes, I accept him into my heart. I accept him as Lord and Savior." Darkness settled upon her and filled every space in and around her. Paralyzed was her body, not from immobility, but from the reality that she no longer had limbs to command. Slowly, a sensation of spinning emerged in her consciousness. Round and round, she spun faster. The twirling gained speed every second, and she began to ascend. She rose off her bed. Her spinning form hovered in the empty air, suspended in an existence where gravity had no hold of her. The outward pull from her circles was comforting and filled her with a sense of balance that lifted her higher and higher. She passed through and across vast expanses of space into the profound emptiness of our universe. She witnessed solar systems, galaxies, and planets pass her by. She saw new stars being birthed and the creation of collapsing of countless worlds. Stellar bodies of churning hot glowing gases and nebulas swirling in complete harmony raced past her at impossible speeds. She exceeded the speed of light and shattered reality, penetrating the membrane that is infinity. Thoughts and reason began to unravel and separate from one another. Faster and faster, she shot through the planes of existence until she stood before the gates of heaven. Though she no longer was bound to a body, she walked through the gates. Though she had no eyes, she looked at the ethereal world that stood before her and saw the people who resided there in paradise. In this incorporeal form, her perceptions were no less than omnipresent. She could view the grass, the trees, and the people from afar or up close all at once. She could see everything from every angle, from below or above, simultaneously. She opened her eyes to all her new companions, who had been rescued by the grace of God and given an eternity of paradise. All at once, she looked into the eyes of men and women of all ages and races. Her eyes met with different people from throughout man's history. Her eyes fell upon her father, and his eyes fell upon her. She took a step back and gasped from surprise. She saw her stepdad and an uncle. The eyes of a former friend who had almost beat her to death for her drugs stared at her intently. More and more people appeared before her, all of them liars, murderers, thieves, and degenerates. Not a single one of them deserving of a heavenly reward in the afterlife. Confusion and fear filled her completely as she continued to look into her father's eyes. Through the haze, the past of those around her appeared before her. It was like trickles of memory flowing before her. The horror from understanding brought her to her knees. She was witnessing their final moments before death. She saw her father lying on the ground with a gunshot wound. She saw another clutching a large knife protruding from her side. Still another lay convulsing on the floor, choking on his own vomit from a massive overdose. They all had one thing in common. With hands interlocked with each other, 7 winged figures stood over the dying sinner and demanded of them to say it. And they said it the moment before they died. Heaven opened her mind and bestowed its revelation upon her. She cried out in despair from the knowledge it had revealed. She would spend eternity standing side by side and next to the ones who had desecrated her body and stolen the beautiful gift of childhood. Even after all the stars have burned out, she would forever look into the eyes of the man who had taken everything she ever had and all she was meant to become. In this existence, God and Satan are the same. There's no difference between heaven and hell, nor is there any difference between an angel and a demon. The creatures in the darkness, shunned by the light of the 7, were not evil. It was trickery to conceal their true identity and purpose. They were oblivion, the true reward from death. It is the only means to attain ascension to greater planes of existence. The mind of man was not intended to have an eternal existence. Man is a being of gratification and experience. always craving something new and different to stimulate his imagination. He quickly and easily grows tired of the old and familiar. Heaven is not a place for such a creature. Its confinement would be a torment to an active mind with nothing new to discover and nothing more to experience. Imagine this existence after 1 year, 10 years, 100 years, or even 1,000 years. Heaven's light burned bright, and its final truth was revealed. All who had passed through these heavenly gates had committed the only sin that was truly unforgivable: to ask and believe thyself forgiven without penance for thy sins at the moment of death is blasphemy. To accept atonement and salvation with thy last breath, with only faith and belief to offer for your admittance to the kingdom of heaven, is a great offense. Paradise is not granted to those who are absent of good deeds and are without charitable works toward your fellow man.